9,156 tanks and 18,470 armored fighting vehicles. That's how many the Russian military lost between February 24th, 2022 and October 31st, 2024, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. If you go by the Oryx numbers, which only cover destroyed equipment of which photo or video evidence is available, the losses are still staggering: 3,536 tanks and 1,723 fighting vehicles. That's more than some countries even have in stock. Russia's largest tank reserve is emptying out. And fast. This base was Russia's ultimate fallback, a vast stockpile meant to keep its military rolling. But now, it's a shadow of what it used to be. With fewer tanks and vehicles left to send to the front lines, Russia's arsenal is in trouble, deep trouble. So how did this massive reserve start running dry? And just how empty is it? Keep watching to find out. To understand why this base emptying out is such a big deal, we first need to look at where it fits in the hierarchy of military storage in Russia. So let's break that down quickly. According to the French think tank L'Institut d'Action Resilience, Russia operates 28 major storage and repair sites, with 24 located in the central and eastern military districts. That's where the majority of the country's military assets are concentrated. Among these bases, 9 are specifically dedicated to storing tanks and armored vehicles. But these aren't just warehouses. They play a critical role in supporting operational units and regenerating equipment for the Russian military. These facilities, referred to as Central Tank Reserve bases, have been around since the end of World War II, housing various tank models from the Soviet era to the present day. They are managed by the General Directorate of Armored Vehicles of the Ministry of Defense, or GAD-2 for short. This agency is tasked with ensuring that the Russian Army's tank fleet is maintained and ready for action. But as you'll soon hear, it doesn't seem that the GAD-2 is doing a really good job. Each Central Tank Reserve base is equipped with a maintenance battalion that oversees the storage and upkeep of the tanks. Maintenance priorities come directly from Russia's general staff, focusing on specific models as needed. These bases are expected to use advanced storage techniques like dry air systems to preserve the armored vehicles effectively. But this part too is highly questionable, as you'll hear later on. Typically, a Central Tank Reserve base includes an administrative building, troop accommodations, hangars for maintenance, and organized storage areas. Each base also features disposal zones for scrap vehicles and possibly even a fuel depot. To support logistics, loading areas for rail transport are located nearby, ensuring smooth operations. Currently, the 9 Central Tank Reserve bases are spread across Russia's military districts. The Western Military District houses only one, the 22nd base in Bai, Kostroma Oblast. The Central Military District is home to 5 Central Tank Reserve bases: the 349th base in Topchika, Altai Krai, the 1,311th base in Verkhnya Pishma, Sverdlovsk Oblast, 2,456th base in Yurkovo, Novosibirsk Oblast, the 2,544th base in Kozulka, Krasnolka, Krasnoyarsk Krai, and the 6,018th base in Kamsyul, Sverdlovsk Oblast. This just leaves the 3 Central Tank Reserve bases in the Eastern Military District: the 111th base in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, Khabarovsk Krai, the 769th base in Ulan-Ude, Buryatia, and the 1,295th base in Arsenyev, Primorsky Krai. In this video, we're zeroing in on the 769th base in Ulan-Ude. But considering the fact that a large chunk of the information we know about this base comes from the extraordinary efforts of the social media sleuths we've mentioned earlier, let's first introduce them. First up is Covert Cabal on YouTube, a channel focused on providing unbiased military analysis. Their impressive 3D model of the 769th base, which captures the smallest details down to light posts, offers a detailed and unprecedented view of the facility. Next, we have at HIMARS on X, who's been meticulously tracking what remains of Soviet and Russian storage bases. Alongside Covert Cabal, they assembled and compiled multiple images to get a complete picture of the 769th base and how it has evolved. With this in mind, let's dive into the specifics. The 769th Central Tank Reserve Base, once known as the 227th Storage and Repair Base, is the crown jewel of Russia's tank storage facilities, or was. Nestled near the capital of Buryatia, Ulan-Ude, this base covers over 3.86 square miles, a vast expanse of land dedicated to military might. Before the war, it was the largest tank storage site in Russia, and it still holds that title today. The primary tank models stored here are the T-72 and T-62, with variants like the classic T-62M, T-72A, T-72 Billion, and the T-72 OBR 1989 making up the bulk of the inventory. Thanks to Covert Cabal's 3D model, we know that the base is divided into three distinct sections: the northern and southern areas for vehicle storage, and a central section for logistics and supply. Interestingly, you can't simply transition from one section to another. Why? Because each section is surrounded by triple layered security fences, so movement between them is cumbersome. To go from one section to another, you must exit through a security checkpoint, drive along the main road, and re-enter through another checkpoint. Now, Russia's military isn't exactly known for its efficiency, but this setup seems like a masterclass in military mismanagement, especially when you consider that the terrain surrounding the 769th base adds another layer of complexity. This mountainous area features uneven ground, making indoor storage garages scarce. As a result, most vehicles at this base are left exposed, with only a few maintenance garages and small covered shelters dotting the landscape. Now, let's rewind the clock and briefly explore the base's history. This story of transformation and decline will reveal how this once proud facility fell into such a pitiful state. The 769th Central Tank Reserve Base has a history that dates back to the 1960s. The first official mention of this base in the West appeared in a CIA report from 1964, shortly after the Sino-Soviet split. In the Soviet Union, this was a time of tension and military buildup in response to the perceived threat from China. So the Soviets were shifting significant forces to the east. The CIA report showcased a sprawling complex filled with massive barracks, though almost none of these original structures remain today. By the early 2000s, the base was functioning with somewhat chaotic organization. The southern section stored reserve vehicles, while the northern section housed vehicles in better condition. It's like the north was the VIP area, while the south was left to gather dust. Interestingly, the very top northern section didn't store anything at all back then, yet it was completely sectioned off. Just imagine a whole section dedicated to nothing. This oddity is a perfect reflection of the broader state of the Russian military at the time, where entire units existed without purpose or functionality. Then came 2008, a pivotal year for the Russian military. Why? Because that's when the Russian military reform, known as the Serdyukov Reform, took place. Now, this wasn't just a tweak here and there. It was a full-on overhaul. The Russian military was set to reduce its strength to 1 million personnel by 2012, which meant cutting down on the number of officers and consolidating the number of military training schools from 65 down to just 10. A similar consolidation was done with the Russian military units and bases. Before the reforms, the Russian ground forces consisted of 24 divisions, including 3 tank divisions, 16 motorized rifle divisions, and 5 machine gun artillery divisions, alongside 2 division-strength military bases located in Armenia and Tajikistan. This structure was bloated and largely ineffective, as only 5 of the motorized rifle divisions were fully operational, and approximately 13% of Army units considered permanently combat ready. By the end of the reforms, 23 of the 24 divisions were disbanded, consolidated and reconstituted into a formation of 4 tank brigades and 35 motorized rifle brigades. The result? The total number of units and formations in the Russian ground forces went from 1,890 to just 190 to just 172. This restructuring aimed to create forces in a state of permanent readiness, drastically cutting down on the number of bases and fostering a more agile military capable of rapid deployment. The 769th base was also part of this restructuring. With tanks left over from the Soviet era but no manpower to operate them, the base essentially became a dumping ground for vehicles. The years following the reforms saw a full-on tank stockpiling frenzy, so by 2011, this base was overflowing with tanks. That's why in 2012, a large-scale vehicle disposal plan was launched, targeting 10,000 tanks for destruction. It's important to note that this is where the misconception arises that Russia still has tens of thousands of tanks in reserve. The reality is quite the opposite. Most of the figures circulating online stem from the Soviet era, but many of the tanks credited to Russia actually now belong to former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, Belarus, and even Ukraine. As of February 24, 2022, estimates suggested that Russia had around 17,500 tanks in reserve, but many of those are stored outside and in poor condition. While these tanks could theoretically serve as spare parts for operational units, as many of them do, listing them as tanks in reserve is still misleading. Recent evaluations indicate nearly 6,000 usable tanks remain, but this is also theoretical, as their condition varies significantly, as you'll soon see. Basically, the idea that Russia has vast reserves of functional tanks is nothing but a myth, But let's get back to the 769th base. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, this once mighty base was cleaned out so hard that it experienced the largest reduction of stored tanks across all Russian facilities since the war began. By late 2022, expert analysis revealed that the base was losing its inventory at a staggering rate. Some reports suggested that the base only had 192 combat-ready tanks, with 152 mothballed outside. Another 519 tanks were in storage, while 664 were slated for scrapping. That's a total of 1,375 tanks. Covert Cabal, however, presented an even direr picture of the stock at the facility. According to them, there were only 857 tanks at the facility. As 2023 rolled in, the situation seemed to only get worse. A glance at the satellite imagery confirmed a drastic drop from 857 tanks in late 2022 to just 630 by April 2023. Most of these were T-72 models, with a few T-62s thrown into the mix. Crunch the numbers from before the war, and that's a staggering 70% reduction in stock. At the time, it was truly astonishing to see Russia's largest tank storage facility stripped of so many of its Soviet-era tanks and armored vehicles so quickly. The worst part? The losses just kept on coming. This brings us to late September of 2024, and the latest findings from Covert Cabal and HIMARS, the findings that clearly show that the 769th base is all but empty. In a video posted on September 28, 2024, Covert Cabal showed that the decline in the number of tanks stored at the 769th base had accelerated dramatically. Previously, from September 2023 to May 2024, the base had lost 48 tanks, averaging less than 7 tanks per month. However, between May and September 2024, the base lost a staggering 79 tanks in just 4 months, which translates to an alarming average of almost 20 tanks per month. This represents a threefold increase in the rate of decline. Now, there was some speculation that winter was to blame, as the cold weather would put the brakes on tank maintenance and logistics. However, the data from the previous summer throws a wrench in that theory. You see, from April to September 2023, tank numbers at the base actually increased by 48. At the time, this unexpected surge had everyone scratching their heads about the sudden shift in dynamics. It also posed additional questions about the reasons behind the current accelerating losses. One of the explanations offered was that another consolidation of equipment was taking place. Recent satellite imagery backed this theory to a degree, as it revealed a flurry of activity at the base, with tanks being loaded onto trains for transport. It looked like Russia was possibly consolidating its tank inventory at a larger base further west. Why west? Because the further west those tanks are, the easier it is to redeploy them to Ukraine if needed. Plus, the only bases located east of the 769th base were the 95th and the 111th, and they had already been almost completely depleted by mid-2023. The other explanation is more straightforward. Russia is replacing its lost tanks. Given the mounting losses from Russia's relentless onslaught across Ukraine's eastern front during the summer and fall, this explanation is more plausible. It's probably a combination of both. But wait a second, things aren't adding up. Even with these staggering losses, there are still hundreds of tanks left at the 769th base. So how can it be nearly empty? Well, the answer lies in the condition of these tanks. You see, the thing about the 769th base is that most of the tanks are stored outside. This approach is actually symptomatic of the Russian military's broader issues with equipment maintenance and logistics. Simply put, the Russian military's tank storage is nothing short of a comedy of errors. For such a vast country covering over 6.6 million square miles of land, Russia sure misses the mark when it comes to choosing locations for its storage bases. They've left these vital assets out in the open, subjected to the elements. The result? They have a rusting fleet that could have been ready for action, but is now little more than a collection of scrap metal. This shouldn't be surprising, as storing military vehicles outside in a country with significant seasonal precipitation is simply asking for trouble. Rain, snow, and wind are relentless enemies, and these tanks have suffered from exposure to it, most of them for years. Many are in such bad shape that they are unlikely to ever see the front lines again. In contrast, while the US has the luxury of storing equipment in dry, desert-like conditions, think of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, Russia, is stuck with storage facilities that are little more than open-air scrapyards. Even locations like Ulan-Ude, which has relatively low yearly precipitation, aren't ideal for long-term storage when half your tanks are rusting away. That's why the Russians have even resorted to some questionable practices like using tubes fitted to tank gun barrels to pump air inside. While this might help to a degree with lowering humidity, it's still a band-aid solution for a much larger problem. To make matters worse, many tanks stored at the 769th base have been stripped for parts. This trend illustrates Moscow's seemingly desperate reliance on deploying aging and damaged tanks, a grim testament to the staggering equipment losses they have faced throughout the conflict. So what you end up with are tanks without turrets and recycling zones, which are essentially useless, yet they continue to occupy precious storage space and add to the total number of tanks counted at the base. But if you truly look at the remaining tanks at this facility, you'll see a collection of rusting hulks of metal rather than a fighting force. Nearly half of the remaining tanks are in such bad shape they seem like relics from a bygone era left to gather dust. The images show that these tanks are packed so tightly that any hope of maintenance is a lost cause. It's abundantly clear that the Russian military is playing a risky game with its aging arsenal, a game that helped to transform the 769th base into essentially a tank burial ground. But this base isn't just a ghost town for tanks. It's also a resting place for a host of other fighting vehicles ready to tell their own tale of neglect. Now, if you look at the numbers of the fighting vehicles stored at the 769th base, you might get a different impression. After all, the number of these vehicles, particularly the BMP models, has remained steady over the past 4 months, currently sitting at 509. Of course, this is still a significant drop from the pre-war figure of 919, about a 45% decline to be exact. But let's be real. Those remaining BMPs aren't in any better shape than the tanks. Though it's hard to get a complete picture from satellite imagery, many appear to be missing turrets, just like the tanks. Others show telltale signs of neglect, with top passenger doors left wide open, exposing the interior to the elements. It's almost as if these vehicles are being put out to pasture rather than prepared for action. Upon closer inspection, you can see that around 25 to 50% of these vehicles have visible defects. And that's just what can be seen from the overhead shots. Covert Cabal estimates that there are only 160 BMPs left that could realistically be brought back into service without major repairs that would likely cost more than these vehicles are even worth in their current state. Interestingly, right after Covert Cabal's September 28th video, satellite imagery was updated, revealing a slight change in the number of fighting vehicles. 19 BMPs had been suddenly added to the base, and where they came from is anyone's guess. But here's the thing. It almost doesn't matter how many BMPs are added to the base or left there. Why? Because they're primarily the BMP-1 model, which is almost 60 years old. Yes, you heard that right, 60. While the BMP-1 was once celebrated for its firepower and mobility, today it pales in comparison to modern armored fighting vehicles. It features a meager 73mm smoothbore gun and a 7.62mm machine gun, which simply can't compete with the advanced armaments found on contemporary IFVs. The design of the BMP-1 reveals even more flaws. The hull offers protection against small arms fire and splinters, but that's about it. Its armor is inadequate against today's battlefield threats, leaving troops vulnerable in a world where armor-piercing rounds are the norm. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, an outdated strategy that won't win you any battles. Its mobility, once a strong point, has also suffered. The BMP-1's diesel engine cranks out a mere 300 horsepower, which may have been adequate decades ago, but in today's combat environment, it's woefully underpowered. It's a vehicle designed for a time gone by, and it shows. The same goes for the remaining tanks at the 769th base. They're mostly T-62s, which turned 63 in 2024. That's right, these tanks are practically antiques. The T-62, with its 41-ton frame and 4-person crew, might have been a decent piece of machinery back in the day, but not anymore. However, that's all Russia has left after 32 months of intense fighting in Ukraine has decimated its modern tank supplies. The Russian army entered the war with about 2,100 T-72s, 500 T-80s, and 400 T-90s, but those reserves have dwindled significantly. As it stands, the T-62 is now becoming one of the main tank types in the Russian army overall, not just in the 769th base, just like HIMARS predicted. In July 2024, he wrote on X, in conclusion, it is likely that Russia will rely increasingly on T-62s and T-90MS as the number of T-80s slowly declines over time. But what does this mean for the Russian army? Well, the T-62 has thinner armor, a mere 115mm main gun, and wait for it, a human loader. This isn't exactly cutting-edge warfare tech. That's why these tanks are easily outmatched by Ukraine's more modern T-64s and are susceptible to mines, drones, artillery, and missiles. Analyst Andrew Perpetua summed it up perfectly: the T-62s are vaguely useful, but only by 1980 standards. With Russia's production of new tanks lagging behind due to financial woes, lack of skilled workers, and missing parts, it seems that these T-62s are the best the Russian military can muster in a pinch. So where does this leave the 769th Central Tank Reserve Base? Well, the situation is far from rosy. The massive drops in equipment previously recorded can largely be attributed to the onset of war and subsequent mobilization efforts. Now, though, the decline is primarily a grim reflection of the relentless losses on the battlefield. Sure, the base retains approximately 65% of its pre-war tanks and 55% of its BMPs. However, these figures aren't entirely indicative of operational strength. Once you factor in the actual condition of these vehicles, the numbers plummet. Covert Cabal estimates that less than 50% of the tanks are in a viable state. And the BMPs. It's less than 30% a sorry state of affairs. In essence, the 769th base has become nothing more than a dumping ground for rusted relics and damaged equipment. With each passing day, the situation looks bleaker, and the chances of turning things around grow slimmer. Still, the Russian military continues to rely on these outdated models, raising a glaring question about its long-term viability on the battlefield. But what do you think? Can Russia do anything to replenish its dwindling stocks, or is the 769th base destined to empty out completely? If you think the latter situation is more likely, let us ask you another question: when will this happen based on the current rate of attrition? Share your predictions in the comments section below. Now, go check out This Is the Reason Why Russia Will Run Out of All Weapons, or click this other video instead.
The decline of the 769th Central Tank Reserve Base, once a symbol of Russia's military might, serves as a stark reminder of the challenges inherent in maintaining a robust military infrastructure during prolonged conflicts. This situation highlights several critical lessons for both military strategists and nations around the world. First, the importance of long-term strategic planning cannot be overstated. The reliance on outdated equipment like the T-62 tanks and BMP-1 fighting vehicles underscores the risks of neglecting modernization in peacetime. Modern warfare evolves rapidly, and without continuous investment in advanced technology and training, even the most formidable forces risk falling behind. Nations must prioritize readiness not just for today, but for the challenges of tomorrow. Second, the logistical issues at the 769th base reveal the dangers of poor resource management. Storing tanks and fighting vehicles outdoors exposed to the elements is a decision that has significantly degraded their usability. This serves as a cautionary tale for military planners worldwide. Proper storage and maintenance are just as crucial as procurement. Investing in infrastructure to protect critical assets can mean the difference between a fleet ready for deployment and one reduced to scrap metal. Third, transparency and adaptability play vital roles in addressing systemic challenges. The loss of operational tanks and the mismanagement of resources are issues that could have been mitigated through more transparent assessment and quicker adaptation to changing conditions. Countries engaged in conflicts must be willing to confront hard truths about their capabilities and adjust strategies accordingly. From a broader perspective, the situation at the 769th base also raises questions about the human and economic cost of prolonged warfare. The reliance on antiquated equipment reflects the toll that extended conflicts take on a nation's industrial capacity and workforce. This reinforces the need for diplomatic efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts before they escalate to prolonged wars of attrition. My personal perspective on this issue is one of cautious reflection. While it is easy to focus on the technical and logistical failures, it is equally important to acknowledge the broader implications of such a decline. The erosion of military assets like those at the 769th base symbolizes a larger issue: the devastating impact of war on national resources and morale. The lessons from this case should encourage nations to focus not only on military strength but also on innovation, efficiency, and sustainability in defense planning. Additionally, this situation serves as a reminder of the human element in warfare. Behind every tank and fighting vehicle are individuals, engineers, mechanics, and soldiers whose efforts and lives are intertwined with these machines. Neglecting the tools of war ultimately neglects the people who depend on them. In conclusion, the story of the 769th base is not merely one of decay and decline. It is a powerful call to action for nations and leaders to prioritize foresight, efficiency, and adaptability in military strategy. By learning from these challenges, countries can better prepare for the future and work towards ensuring that military resources are both effective and sustainable. Let this be a moment to reflect on how we can prevent history from repeating itself.